You won't believe how badly Tim Hortons has fallen. What was once Canada's beloved coffee shop, a symbol of national pride and quality, has become a corporate nightmare that's destroying everything Canadians once loved about it. Here's what's shocking. Tim Hortons used to be the place where hockey players grabbed coffee before games, where families stopped on road trips, where you could count on fresh donuts and decent coffee. Now, it's become a Brazilian-owned fast food chain that's more concerned with profit margins than the customers who built their empire. But this isn't just about bad coffee or stale donuts. This is about corporate greed destroying a Canadian institution. We're talking about a company that fired Canadian bakers, replaced fresh ingredients with frozen garbage, and turned their back on the very people who made them successful. The numbers are staggering. Tim Hortons has lost over 30% of their customer satisfaction ratings in just 5 years. Their stock price has plummeted, franchisees are going bankrupt, and Canadians are finally waking up to what this company has become. But the real story is even worse than you think. Behind the scenes, Tim Hortons has been cutting corners, exploiting workers, and serving food that would make a gas station blush. The company that once represented Canadian values has become everything Canadians hate about corporate America. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to expose exactly how Tim Hortons went from Canada's sweetheart to Canada's biggest disappointment. From the Brazilian takeover that changed everything, to the frozen food scandal that destroyed their reputation. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Tim Hortons is dying and why they deserve it. Before we dive into the disaster, let me remind you what Tim Hortons used to be. Back in the day, Tim Hortons wasn't just a coffee shop. It was a Canadian institution that actually lived up to its reputation. Every morning, bakers would arrive at 4 a.m. to make fresh donuts from scratch. Real bakers, using real ingredients, creating donuts that were still warm when you bought them at 7 a.m. The coffee was decent, the service was friendly, and you knew exactly what you were getting. Tim Hortons locations were community gathering places. Hockey teams would stop by after practice. Construction workers would grab coffee and breakfast sandwiches made with real eggs. Families would go for Sunday morning donuts that were actually made that day, not shipped frozen from a factory. The company was Canadian-owned, Canadian-operated, and genuinely cared about Canadian customers. They sponsored local hockey teams, supported community events, and treated their employees like human beings instead of disposable labor. Their marketing wasn't just advertising, it was celebrating Canadian culture. Double Double became part of the Canadian vocabulary. Roll Up the Rim was a national event that brought people together. Tim Hortons understood that they weren't just selling coffee. They were selling Canadian identity. But most importantly, the food was real. Donuts were made fresh daily. Soup was made from actual ingredients. Even their breakfast sandwiches used real eggs cracked in store. It wasn't gourmet, but it was honest food made by people who cared about quality. Those days are gone forever. What happened next is a masterclass in how corporate greed can destroy everything good about a company. Everything changed in 2014 when Tim Hortons was bought by Restaurant Brands International, a company controlled by Brazilian investment firm 3G Capital. This wasn't just a change in ownership, it was a complete transformation of everything Tim Hortons represented. 3G Capital is known for one thing: cutting costs at any expense. They don't care about quality, customer satisfaction, or employee welfare. They care about profit margins, and they'll destroy anything that gets in the way of maximizing those margins. The first thing they did was fire the Canadian executives who understood the brand and replace them with cost-cutting specialists whose only job was to squeeze every penny out of the operation. These weren't restaurant people, they were corporate raiders. Within months, the changes started. The fresh baking program that had defined Tim Hortons for decades was eliminated. Instead of baking donuts fresh in each location, they would be made in centralized factories, frozen, and shipped to stores to be reheated. But it wasn't just donuts. Everything became centralized and processed. Soups that used to be made from real ingredients became powder mixes. Breakfast sandwiches that used to be made with real eggs became pre-made frozen patties. Even the coffee changed as they switched to cheaper suppliers. The Brazilian owners didn't understand Canadian culture, and they didn't care to learn. They saw Tim Hortons as just another fast food chain to be optimized for profit. The idea that it was a cultural institution meant nothing to them. They also started expanding aggressively into international markets, diluting the brand and spreading resources thin. Instead of focusing on maintaining quality in Canada, they were more interested in opening locations in places where people had never heard of Tim Hortons. The writing was on the wall. Tim Hortons was no longer a Canadian company that happened to sell coffee. It was a Brazilian-owned corporation that happened to operate in Canada. The elimination of fresh baking wasn't just a business decision, it was the death of Tim Hortons' soul. For over 40 years, the smell of fresh donuts baking was what made Tim Hortons special. That smell, that experience, that connection to real food, all gone. Here's how the new system works. Donuts are made in massive industrial facilities, flash frozen, and shipped to stores in trucks. Employees then reheat them in convection ovens and pretend they're fresh. It's the fast food equivalent of lying to your customers' faces. But the frozen donuts aren't just inferior, they're often stale, dry, and flavorless. The freezing and reheating process destroys the texture and taste that made Tim Hortons donuts worth eating. What you get now is a sugar-coated disappointment that bears no resemblance to what they used to serve. The company tried to spin this as innovation and consistency. They claimed that centralized production would ensure every donut was exactly the same, but customers didn't want consistency. They wanted quality. They wanted donuts that tasted like they were made with care, not processed in a factory. Former bakers were devastated. These were skilled workers who took pride in their craft, who got up at 4 a.m. every day to make something people enjoyed. They were replaced by minimum wage workers whose only job was to operate reheating equipment. The impact on franchisees was immediate. Customer complaints skyrocketed, sales dropped. The signature experience that had built Tim Hortons' reputation was gone, replaced by the kind of processed food you could get anywhere. But Tim Hortons didn't stop there. They eliminated fresh soup preparation, switched to pre-made sandwich fillings, and even started using artificial flavoring in their coffee. Every change was designed to cut costs, and every change made the food worse. The message was clear. Tim Hortons no longer cared about food quality. They cared about profit margins, and if that meant serving inferior products to loyal customers, so be it. As if destroying their core products wasn't enough, Tim Hortons decided to completely abandon their identity by adding dozens of new menu items that had nothing to do with coffee and donuts. This wasn't expansion, it was desperation. Suddenly, Tim Hortons was trying to compete with McDonald's, Subway, and every other fast food chain. They added burgers, wraps, pizza, smoothies, and even tried to become a lunch destination. But here's the problem. They had no idea how to make any of these foods well. The burgers were pathetic. Thin, flavorless patties that tasted like cardboard. The pizza was a joke. Frozen discs with artificial cheese that wouldn't fool a 5-year-old. The wraps were soggy messes filled with processed ingredients that had no business being called food. But the real disaster was in the execution. Tim Hortons locations weren't designed to handle complex menus. They didn't have the equipment, the training, or the systems to prepare dozens of different items quickly and safely. The result was chaos. Wait times exploded as confused employees tried to figure out how to make items they'd never been properly trained on. Food safety became a nightmare as the same equipment was used for different products without proper cleaning. Quality control became impossible when every location was trying to be a full restaurant. The menu explosion also confused customers. People came to Tim Hortons for coffee and donuts, not for bad burgers and terrible pizza. Instead of improving their core products, they were wasting time and money on items nobody wanted. Franchisees were furious. They were forced to buy expensive new equipment, train staff on complicated procedures, and stock ingredients for items that barely sold. Their costs went up while their sales went down. The worst of both worlds. The company's focus was completely scattered. Instead of perfecting coffee and baked goods, they were trying to be everything to everyone. The result was that they became good at nothing. This menu explosion perfectly captured everything wrong with the new Tim Hortons. They had lost their identity, abandoned their strengths, and were desperately chasing trends instead of serving their customers. While Tim Hortons was busy destroying their food quality, they were also waging war against their own employees. The company that once prided itself on being a good employer became notorious for exploiting workers and treating them like disposable resources. The most shocking example came in 2018 when Ontario raised the minimum wage. Instead of absorbing the cost like a responsible employer, many Tim Hortons franchisees, with corporate support, cut employee benefits, eliminated paid breaks, and made workers pay for their own uniforms. But it gets worse. Some locations started charging employees for drinks, making them pay for meals they were previously given for free, and even started charging them for the privilege of working there. This wasn't cost management. It was pure greed. The company also ramped up their use of the temporary foreign worker program, bringing in workers from other countries who could be paid less and were less likely to complain about working conditions. Meanwhile, Canadian workers were laid off or had their hours cut. Working conditions became terrible. Understaffed locations meant employees were expected to do the work of 2 or 3 people. Equipment wasn't maintained properly, leading to dangerous working conditions. Training was minimal because properly training employees costs money. The franchise model became a way to avoid responsibility. When labor violations were exposed, corporate would blame individual franchisees. When franchisees complained about impossible cost pressures, corporate would blame market conditions. Nobody took responsibility for the systematic exploitation of workers. Employee turnover skyrocketed. Experienced workers left for better jobs, and they were replaced by inexperienced workers who received minimal training. This created a cycle where service quality got worse, which made working conditions even more stressful. The company that once sponsored community hockey teams was now exploiting the very communities they claimed to serve. Tim Hortons had become everything Canadians hate about corporate culture: greedy, heartless, and completely disconnected from the people who made them successful. By 2018, the quality collapse at Tim Hortons was undeniable. Every aspect of the customer experience had deteriorated to the point where going to Tim Hortons became an exercise in disappointment. The coffee, which had never been great but was at least consistent, became unpredictable. Some locations served coffee that was burnt and bitter. Others served coffee that was weak and flavorless. The consistency that corporate claimed to value was nowhere to be found. The donuts were a disaster. Customers regularly complained about donuts that were stale, dry, or obviously reheated. The glazes were often cracked or missing entirely. What used to be a simple pleasure became a gamble. Would you get something edible or something that belonged in the trash? But the breakfast sandwiches were perhaps the worst casualty. What used to be made with real eggs cracked in-store became pre-made frozen patties that were often cold in the middle or overcooked to the point of being inedible. The English muffins were frequently stale, and the cheese was often not even melted. Service times, which had always been Tim Hortons' strength, became a nightmare. The complex menu meant longer wait times. Understaffed locations meant longer lines. Poorly trained employees meant more mistakes and more delays. The locations themselves started looking run down. Equipment wasn't maintained properly. Cleaning standards dropped. Many locations looked more like gas station convenience stores than the welcoming coffee shops they used to be. Customer complaints flooded social media. People shared photos of moldy donuts, cold coffee, and sandwiches that looked nothing like the menu pictures. The company's response was usually to blame individual locations rather than address the systematic problems. The loyalty that had taken decades to build was evaporating. Canadians who had been going to Tim Hortons for their entire lives started looking for alternatives. The company that had once been synonymous with Canadian identity was becoming a national embarrassment. While Tim Hortons was busy destroying itself, their competitors were paying attention. McDonald's in particular saw an opportunity to steal market share from a weakened competitor, and they executed their plan perfectly. McDonald's launched their McCafe program with a brilliant strategy. They hired Tim Hortons' former coffee supplier and started serving better coffee than Tim Hortons at competitive prices. The irony was perfect. McDonald's was now serving the coffee that Tim Hortons used to serve. But McDonald's didn't stop there. They improved their breakfast menu, added real eggs to their breakfast sandwiches, and started promoting themselves as the better choice for Canadian coffee drinkers. Their marketing directly targeted Tim Hortons' weaknesses. The results were devastating for Tim Hortons. McDonald's coffee sales exploded while Tim Hortons' sales declined. Customers who had never considered McDonald's for coffee were switching in droves. The fast food chain was out-executing the coffee chain at their own game. Other competitors also moved in. Starbucks expanded their Canadian presence. Local coffee shops started gaining market share. Even gas stations started serving better coffee than Tim Hortons. The company that had once dominated the Canadian coffee market was being attacked from all sides. The competitive pressure exposed just how far Tim Hortons had fallen. When customers had limited options, they tolerated poor quality, but when better alternatives became available, they abandoned Tim Hortons without hesitation. Tim Hortons' response was typically tone-deaf. Instead of improving their products, they launched marketing campaigns trying to appeal to Canadian nostalgia. They tried to remind people of what Tim Hortons used to be instead of fixing what it had become. The company also tried to compete on price, offering deals and promotions that further eroded their already thin profit margins. But customers weren't leaving because of price. They were leaving because of quality. No amount of discounting could fix fundamental product problems. As Tim Hortons' problems mounted, the people who were supposed to be their partners, the franchisees, started fighting back. These were business owners who had invested their life savings in Tim Hortons locations, and they were watching their investments crumble. The Great White North Franchisee Association, representing hundreds of Tim Hortons owners, went public with their complaints. They accused corporate of making decisions that hurt franchisees while protecting corporate profits. They demanded changes to the business model that was destroying their livelihoods. Franchisees complained that they were forced to sell products at prices that didn't cover their costs. They were required to participate in promotions that lost money. They had to buy equipment and ingredients from corporate-approved suppliers at inflated prices. The relationship between corporate and franchisees became openly hostile. Lawsuits were filed, public statements were made. The family-like culture that had once defined Tim Hortons was replaced by corporate warfare. Some franchisees tried to sell their locations, but found that Tim Hortons franchises had become nearly worthless. Who would want to buy a business that was losing customers, losing money, and had no prospects for improvement? Others simply walked away, abandoning their investments rather than continuing to lose money. Locations closed permanently, leaving gaps in Tim Hortons' coverage and further damaging the brand's reputation. The franchise rebellion exposed the fundamental problem with Tim Hortons' business model. They were extracting value from franchisees and customers without providing value in return. This wasn't sustainable, and the system was collapsing. Corporate's response was to blame franchisees for the company's problems. They claimed that individual operators weren't following standards or weren't properly trained, but the problems were too widespread and too consistent to be explained by individual failures. Faced with mounting criticism and declining sales, Tim Hortons tried several desperate attempts to turn things around. Each attempt revealed just how out of touch the company had become with their customers and their own identity. First, they tried to win back customers with nostalgia campaigns. They brought back old commercials, referenced their hockey heritage, and tried to remind Canadians of the good old days. But nostalgia can't fix stale donuts and terrible coffee. Customers saw right through the emotional manipulation. Then they tried the back-to-basics approach, promising to focus on coffee and donuts again. But instead of actually improving quality, they just simplified the marketing message while keeping the same frozen, reheated products. It was all style and no substance. They launched the Tim's Rewards program, thinking that loyalty points would keep customers coming back. But rewards programs only work if customers actually want to return. You can't bribe people into accepting poor quality with free coffee after 10 purchases. Tim Hortons also tried to blame external factors for their problems. They claimed that changing consumer preferences, increased competition, and economic conditions were responsible for their decline, but their competitors were thriving in the same market conditions. The company brought in new executives who promised to fix Tim Hortons. Each new leader announced bold plans and transformation strategies, but the fundamental problems, poor food quality, bad service, and corporate greed, remained unchanged. They tried limited-time offers and seasonal promotions to generate excitement. Pumpkin spice everything, summer drink specials, holiday-themed donuts, but gimmicks can't replace quality. Customers tried the promotions once and then remembered why they stopped coming. The most desperate attempt was trying to position Tim Hortons as a premium brand. They raised prices, redesigned some locations, and tried to compete with Starbucks. But you can't charge premium prices for inferior products. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Each failed turnaround attempt made the situation worse. Customers lost more faith in the brand. Franchisees became more frustrated. Employees became more demoralized. Tim Hortons was trapped in a death spiral of their own making. The decline of Tim Hortons wasn't just a business story. It was a cultural tragedy that affected Canadian identity itself. For generations, Tim Hortons had been woven into the fabric of Canadian life, and watching it crumble was like watching a piece of Canada die. Hockey parents who used to stop at Tim Hortons after games started going elsewhere. The tradition of Timmy's runs during work breaks became less common as people found better alternatives. Even the phrase double-double started to fade from Canadian vocabulary. The company that had once united Canadians across regional and cultural differences became a source of national disappointment. Social media was filled with Canadians sharing their Tim Hortons horror stories: cold coffee, stale donuts, terrible service. The shared experience was now one of shared frustration. International perception of Canada was also affected. Tim Hortons had been one of Canada's most recognizable brands globally, representing Canadian values of friendliness, quality, and community. Now it represented corporate greed and declining standards. The loss was particularly painful for older Canadians who remembered when Tim Hortons was actually good. They had to watch something they they loved and trusted become unrecognizable. It was like losing a friend to corporate greed. Younger Canadians, meanwhile, couldn't understand what the fuss was about. To them, Tim Hortons had always been mediocre. They didn't have the emotional connection that made the decline so painful for their parents and grandparents. The cultural impact extended beyond just coffee and donuts. Tim Hortons had been a symbol that Canadian companies could compete with American corporations while maintaining Canadian values. Its failure suggested that maybe those values couldn't survive in the modern business world. Local coffee shops and regional chains started positioning themselves as the real Canadian alternative to Tim Hortons. They emphasized fresh baking, local sourcing, and community connection, everything Tim Hortons had abandoned. Today, Tim Hortons is a shadow of its former self, limping along on brand recognition while delivering an experience that would have been unthinkable during their golden years. The numbers tell the story of a company in terminal decline. Customer satisfaction ratings have plummeted to historic lows. Tim Hortons consistently ranks at the bottom of coffee shop satisfaction surveys, behind McDonald's, Starbucks, and even gas station coffee. The brand that once defined Canadian coffee culture is now its biggest disappointment. Sales continue to decline as customers abandon the brand for better alternatives. Same-store sales have been negative for years, meaning existing locations are serving fewer customers and generating less revenue. The growth that once seemed unstoppable has reversed completely. The quality problems persist and may be getting worse. Social media is filled with fresh horror stories, moldy donuts, cold coffee, inedible breakfast sandwiches. The company seems incapable of maintaining even basic food safety and quality standards. Employee morale remains terrible. High turnover means most locations are staffed by inexperienced workers who receive minimal training. The friendly service that once characterized Tim Hortons has been replaced by indifferent employees who are just trying to get through their shifts. Franchisees continue to struggle and fail. Many locations have closed permanently, creating gaps in coverage that further damage the brand. The franchise model that once made Tim Hortons profitable has become a liability. The company's attempts at innovation continue to fail. New menu items are ignored by customers who have lost faith in Tim Hortons' ability to execute anything well. Marketing campaigns fall flat because they can't overcome the reality of poor products and service. International expansion has been largely unsuccessful. Without the cultural connection that once drove Canadian loyalty, Tim Hortons is just another mediocre fast food chain competing in crowded markets against better established competitors. The downfall of Tim Hortons is a masterclass in how corporate greed can destroy everything good about a beloved brand. What was once a symbol of Canadian values and quality has become a cautionary tale about what happens when profit margins matter more than customers. But this isn't just about one company, it's about a pattern we see across industries. When foreign investors buy beloved local brands, they often strip away everything that made them special in pursuit of short-term profits. Tim Hortons is just the most visible example. The saddest part is that this was completely avoidable. Tim Hortons could have maintained their quality, treated their employees well, and remained profitable. Instead, they chose greed over everything else, and now they're paying the price. If this video opened your eyes to how corporate greed destroyed a Canadian institution, share it with other Canadians who remember when Tim Hortons was actually good. They deserve to know why their favorite coffee shop became a national embarrassment. And if you want more exposés about how corporations are destroying the brands and institutions we love, hit that subscribe button. I'm not done exposing the lies and greed that are ruining everything good in this world. Remember, every dollar you spend is a vote for the kind of business practices you want to see. Stop supporting companies that treat you like garbage. Find local alternatives that actually care about quality and community. Tim Hortons forgot that customers have choices. Make sure they remember.